It's Tuesday, the 25th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story. Lagos Assembly Speaker. Miranda may step down as Akande panel shortlist 7. Panel recommends Obasa's resignation. Akande or Saba to brief Tinubu on reports. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper and above the leading story from the left. 2027, APC berates El-Rufai for attack on Tinubu. Ribadu. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Filling station short. Loading halt as Lagos impounds tankers. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the Punch newspaper. IBB's book. Don't tarnish Brewett's name. Family warns Obasanjo. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the Punch newspaper. Tax reform. Senate asks federal government states to firm up agreements. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story. Ayedatiwa begins new term. Fasoranti's son. Others get cabinet appointments. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the Punch newspaper. Osun crisis. LG workers shun APC's chairman ultimatum to resume. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the Punch newspaper. $4.5 billion fraud. Emefiele alleges bias. Demands judge withdrawal. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the Punch newspaper. Ex-Nigerian NSA linked to $1 million US horse farm, says report. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Nigerian Tribune. The leading story. APC has left me, says El-Rufai. Says Tinubu. North Senate rejected his ministerial nomination. Fourth implementation of President's economic policies. Hints at possibility of joining another political platform. Rules out PDP. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Tax reform bills, future of Nigeria, says Senate President. Says not up to 30% of Nigerians pay tax. RMAFC urges Senate to adopt governor's position on new VAT formula. You can get all of this story on page 21 of the newspaper. PDP. Court orders INEC to stay action on Ayawu sack. Party. Udo Koye applied to join suit. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Tribune. Adebanjo for burial May 3. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper and below the leading story from the left. Ayedatiwa sworn in as Ondo governor. Appoint Fasoranti's son as SSG. You can get the complete story on page 15 of the Tribune. Police begin probe as residents claim 22 killed in Edo clashes. You can get the complete story on page 25 of the newspaper. Why Nigerian Tribune was among first to be granted interview upon my assumption of office, says Babangida. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the newspaper. Osun APC LG chairman give workers ultimatum to resume. Accuse Adeleke, Makinde, Bala Mohammed of igniting crisis. They lack power to intimidate, threaten workers, says NLC, TUC. APC only interested in burning down Osun, Adeleke spokesman. They are still smarting from loss suffered at the LG pool, says Makinde's aide. You can get all of this story on page 3 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian. The leading story. Prison decongestion. 53,225 pre-trial detainees languish in jail despite push to pardon politicians. You can get all of this story on page 6 of The Guardian and above the leading story from the left. 400,000 per truck. Maritime transporters threaten strike over extortion in Lagos. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Native doctors protest. Alleged witch hunt by Soludo's administration. You can get the complete story on page 8 of The Guardian. NNPP suspends serving Kano Senator 3 reps. You can get the complete story on page 30 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left. El-Rufai threatened to dump APC over lack of internal democracy. Rules out PDP move. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. Tinubu considered committee for fresh census. You can get the complete story on page 29 of The Guardian. Tinubu tax National Assembly on workable tax law. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Drug abuse. 1 million of Northwest. 3 million addicts in Kano, says Panorama. You can get the complete story on page 2 of The Guardian. Abia, Rivers, Zamfara, Kano, 11 others lack female lawmakers. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. Ayedatiwa takes oath of office. Pardons 43 inmates at inauguration. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust, the leading story. Proponents, opponents dissect Tinubu's tax reform bills. ACF submits memoranda. We will be through, says Akpabio. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the Daily Trust and above the leading story from the left. Customs withdraw 4% import charges. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Daily Trust. Tinubu to set up committee on census. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the Daily Trust. NNPP, Kwankwaso's faction. Rurum differ over suspension. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Daily Trust and below the leading story. Tinubu, North National Assembly dropped me as minister, says El-Rufai. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the Daily Trust. Tenant beats up landlord over house rent. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Daily Trust. Drug abuse, domestic violence on increase in Northwest, says Speaker. You can get the complete story on page 13 of the newspaper. 9 killed, 3 injured in Lagos-Ibadan road crash. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Daily Trust. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. Tax evasion. NLC, TUC, NECA tackle Akpabio over comments. Only 30% of Nigerians pay tax, yet want the best from government, says Akpabio. Sales tax reforms. Future of Nigeria. People evade tax where government is unaccountable, says NLC. Name Nigerians evading tax payment. TUC challenges Akpabio. Blame government for evasion of tax payment, says NECA. Give me workable laws from tax reform bills, Tinubu tells Senate. You can get all of this story on page 5 of the Vanguard and above the leading story. Naira hit 7 months high. Appreciate to 1,500 Naira per dollar in parallel markets. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. Why Nigeria suffer 5 military coups, says IBB. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Vanguard. Osun LG, Adeleke, APC lock horns over festering crisis. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. Tinubu, not NAS blocked my ministerial appointment, says El-Rufai. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard and below the leading story from the right. Wet season. Farmers predict high food prices this year. You can get the complete story on page 11 of the newspaper. Kano APC chairmanship. Minister threatens to resign. Dump party. You can get the complete story on page 25 of the Vanguard. PDP crisis. Court orders INEC to stay action on Ayawo sack. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Lagos Assembly crisis. Miranda may step down as Speaker. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. ACF writes NAS opposes VAT hike. You can get the complete story on page 25 of the Vanguard. 2026 FIFA World Cup qualifier. Dele Bashiru's relief for Chile as test confirmed brief injury timeline. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the last paper on the list, Business Day, the leading story. Naira gains against pound, euro, Canadian dollar since FMs. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper, and below the leading story from the left. Ola Agri closes $1.8 billion sale to Saudi as shares jump. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Victor Osimhen's Manchester United move, 95% completed. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper, and these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.